Hello everybody, it's Stephen and Walter here for So Chatty this week, episode number 7, I believe it is. And today we thought we'd talk all about needles. Now before we get started in that, the whole discussion about needles is one that is extremely confusing. So we have notes for all of this. And we're not experts on needles, but between the two of us, we probably know enough that'll get the beginner by on this. Now, don't quote us on some of these things, because some of these things we might have wrong, but I found some handouts about needles that explain them fairly clearly and are fairly detailed and reliable, I think, and I've put the link to these notes in the show notes below as well. So we're just going to start off, and we've got some pictures of needles to show you as well as we talk about them. But the first thing that I found is, and we're going to have a little discussion between the two of us about these things. We may disagree about some things. We'll see. So some rules about needles, first of all, I found in this one before we get right into talking about various needles. One rule is choose the right needle type and the needle size for the fabric. As you're going to find out, there are different needles for different fabrics. Now, when you first start sewing or quilting, you may not realize that. And not all needles are alike either, because I used to use a needle for quilting called a quilting needle. And I have since found that a titanium needle I like better. But we'll talk about those specifics. But in garment sewing, what's one of the common mistakes people make with fabric?
Well, the difference is sewing like denser fabrics or cotton fabrics and fabrics that are stretchy kind of require two different needles. The stretchier fabric needs what they call a ballpoint needle, which isn't quite as sharp at the end as a needle that you would sew cotton or jean material with. So it's a specialty needle. If you use the jean type needle or the cotton type needle for a jersey, for instance, it can actually damage the fabric, whereas the jersey needle, instead of damaging the fabric, it pushes the fabric threads apart rather than cutting them.
Okay.
So so there's different types of needles that you need for different types of garment sewing.
Yeah, so we're going to come back to that as we talk about the different types of needles that there are. But that is one of the first mistakes people make. They think, well, I'll use any old needle, it's still sewing. And no, and that's when you can have troubles with your sewing machine too.
And some people think that, okay, well, if I need different needles for different projects, why don't I just buy something called a universal needle?
Ah, yes. Universal needle is not universal. They can work for most tasks, but again, you have to know your fabric, what kind it is. But we're going to come back to that in a moment. Another rule is new project, new needle. How many times have we heard stories, we've seen things on YouTube, on the internet, people complaining that their needle isn't sewing properly, they're having a lot of thread breaks or things like that, and then you say to them, well, did you change your needle? Well, no. Walter actually has been taking a class where he has one person who had never changed her needle.
Ever. Yeah. In her sewing machine.
And she'd had her sewing machine for how long?
Well, she didn't have it for very long, but she had it for about a year, and in that time she had sewn several projects. And even though the instructor in the class said at the beginning of each class, he kept saying, make sure you have a new needle in to your machine, but it sort of went on deaf ears. And then she had problems with her sewing, and one of the questions was, have you changed your needle? And the response was, oh, I can change my needle?
Yeah.
So, you have to change your needles on a regular basis.
And this isn't an isolated situation, because I have heard many people, when I've gone to sewing classes, some new people in a sewing class did not realize you needed to change your needle. And then the question comes, well, how often do you need to change your needle? Well, I change my needle after every major project. I mean, come on, let's not be cheap. All right? Needles don't cost that much. You can get needles in Canadian dollars for under $10 for usually a package of 5. That isn't expensive. They're the most important part of your sewing machine. They're the most important part of your whole sewing experience. So, yeah, don't get cheap. Change your needle out. The other thing you may find, too, is if you change, sometimes needles have little burrs on them. That happens in manufacturing. Now, it doesn't happen often, but it can happen. So if you find you've put a brand new needle into your sewing machine and your thread is still breaking, you might want to run your finger along the needle, take it out of your machine first, run your finger along the eye and along the shaft and see if anything feels a little rough. That's a burr. And a burr can catch on the thread. And we're going to talk about the anatomy of a needle in a moment, but you'll know what I mean by then, why it can catch onto that. But if it's a little rough spot on there, that can shred your thread very easily. So what can you do about that? Throw that needle out safely and put in a new one. It happens. It happens. So not often. But
not only that, sometimes, especially what I sew a lot of very thick fabrics, and thick when it gets to thick joints and that, and occasionally you can actually bend your needle trying to get through that material. So if you bend your needle even a little bit, it can throw your whole sewing experience off.
And even if you can't see the bend, it doesn't take much to throw it off. If it hits your needle plate, for example, you put in the wrong needle plate and you forgot, and you went to do, say, a zigzag stitch and you had your straight stitch plate in there, well, it's going to come down and hit on metal. And you'll know when it's hit because it makes a horrible sound.
And as soon as it does that, you need a new needle.
Oh, yeah. And even if you look at the needle and think, well, no, that's really not that bent that much, take your needle out, lay it on top of a flat surface, and put a brand new needle beside it, and you will see that there's probably a warp in it. So just to be on the safe side, if this happens to you, consider your needle a write-off, put in a new needle. Always make sure you have a good supply of needles on hand. And speaking of bent, rule number 3, never sew over a pin. Because that, if your needle hits the pin, it's metal hitting metal, it's going to break the needle, break the pin, or bend the needle. Also, there's a health hazard here, a danger. A little piece of that could go flying off and put out your eye. Get it in your eye.
If your needle breaks and the shard, the end, the tip or whatever breaks off, it can go anywhere.
Yep.
And an eye is not a good place for it.
And how do I know this? Because I've broken needles before. I have never sewn over top of it, and that's a lie. I have. One time I forgot to I was playing chicken with it. Don't play chicken. I looked, oh yeah, this is a fairly large stitch, it'll miss it. Yeah, it didn't. It got it. Don't do it. It's not worth it. 4th rule. If a needle is leaving visible holes in your fabric or skipping stitches, stop sewing. You should change your needle to the correct size and type for the fabric and thread you're sewing with. So that's another thing. The hole of a needle, the eye of a needle, is not the same size for all needles or weights of thread. You have to match the weight of your thread up with the proper needle. If your hole's too small, you'll shred your thread and it's going to break. If your hole's too big, you'll get missed stitches because your needle isn't picking up the thread properly for that. So again, you've got to know those, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later on too.
And sometimes the performance of a needle can vary from machine to machine.
Yes. Yeah. And also you want to make sure that you've installed your needle correctly. There is a flat side and a round side to most needles. And you put the flat side of the needle to the back of the machine.
We're talking
domestic machines.
Machine needles. I know that long arm needles go in differently sometimes, depending on the long arm.
But we're not talking about long arms because we don't have a long arm.
We're just talking here in this thing, domestic sewing machines. Just nothing else.
So, number 5, when in doubt, change the needle. Listen carefully. A dull needle will make a thunk, thunk, thunk sound each time it pierces the fabric. Yes, it will. I've heard that. After a while, if you're a brand new sewer, after time goes by, a few weeks or whatever, if you've been sewing a lot, you're going to get used to the sounds that your sewing machine makes. And you know, that is a good thing, because when your machine is making a different noise than it usually does, and it may be subtle, it's not necessarily a great big clang sound like warning horns going off, but you'll hear it, and that's when you should need to stop and think about what could be the problem. And if you hear that thunk thunk, that's the needle trying to get through your fiber, and it can't because the needle's too dull. So basically, instead of slicing through neatly into the fabric, it's basically pressing a hole through the fabric, and that's going to make your stitching jagged, your stitches uneven, and it's just going to fray your fabric as well. So again, change the needle. So that takes us to the anatomy of a sewing needle. So I'm just going to put up a slide here for these things so you can see what we're talking about. So here we have the anatomy of a sewing needle. And this is how most sewing needles are designed. So at the very top of it, where the blue part is that we're seeing on this particular needle, and we're going to talk about the colors too in a while, because the colors do mean something. They're not just there to be pretty. That's the butt. The butt goes into the sewing machine, and on one side it's going to be rounded, like the side they're showing right now, and the opposite side is flattened, and that's so you will get the needle into the machine correctly. You'll feel it. When you put the needle up into the machine, you will feel whether it's going in correctly or not, and it may be just a question of you just slightly turning it one way or the other to get it lined up properly. But also make sure that the butt is up as far as it can possibly go before you tighten the nut, because and this will really affect your automatic threaders, if you don't get that needle up there right up as far as it goes, then the needle will be out of, or the needle hole, the needle eye will be out of alignment, and if you're using an automatic threader, it's not going to thread. And it can also alter your stitches as well. Sewing machines are built with absolute timing. Everything has to work together to get a perfect stitch, and when one thing is off, everything is off. The next part is the shoulder, and that's just the part of the needle that is starting to slope down to the rest of the needle, which is called the shaft. Now the shaft has a groove cut in it on one side, which this picture doesn't really show very well. But that groove is for your thread to fall into, so that when the needle goes through the fabric, the thread goes with it. It's not hanging outside of the needle itself. And at near the end, by the eye, that's called the scarf. And the scarf is actually a part that bulges out a little bit more, and that's what carries your thread, because the eye is there, and that makes sure that the thread can go through the hole. Kind of stretches it out a little bit. The needle punches the hole in, pierces the hole, but then the scarf allows the thread, which is a little wider, to go through and come back out evenly. And then at the very end, which I have to look at because of my camera's in the way, is the tip, and that of course is the point of the needle. So that's all there is. All needles pretty much look like this. That's their anatomy. So all we're going to be talking about is the size of the needle, which basically has to do with the size of the eyelet itself, or the eye itself. Okay. Yeah, so what's that take us to? I'm just looking at my notes here, and we'll move to the next slide. Now the next slide, in these things that I picked up, this article was pretty much about Schmidt's needles, because they're one of the most common type. But there is something in Europe called Class A, or Class, and they're more, they're a German company, and I think they're very popular in Europe, and that's what this picture is showing. But for most of us in North America, we are very familiar with Schmidt's needles. Now, of course, your sewing company, the machine supplier, may often have needles specific for them. Like Janome has their own line of Janome needles, which we will talk about since we have Janome machines in a while. But
then there's the other big brand which a lot of machines use.
Is Organ
needles.
Yeah, I was going to come to that. Well, we'll come to those ones in a moment. But just about Schmidt's, in the notes here it says Schmidt's also color codes their sewing machine needles for our convenience. The top band of color indicates the needle type, and the bottom band of the color the needle size. And then they have a link there where you can go to see what those all mean. So you notice on the Schmidt's picture, they have a purple line. That's probably stands for the microtext, like the ones that they're
the top
there.
There's two lines on the Schmidt's needles, and I can't remember. The top represents the
Do you want to show that?
The top, and this is probably not a good example. The top represents, I don't know if you can see that. I don't think you can.
It's not very clear.
Okay. I wish I had my notes now with me, but the top band represents either the type of needle, and the other one represents the size.
Yeah, well, according to Schmidt's, the top color indicates needle type, and the bottom band, the needle size.
Okay, so these are jeans needle. So jeans needles are always blue. So all the Schmidt's jeans needles have a blue band at the top, and all the Schmidt, and this is a 80-12 needle, and it's orange at the bottom. So all the 80-12 needles are orange at the bottom for all the needles across the band.
Now we're going to talk about those numbers in a moment too, so hold on to that idea. So the color coding, now personally I never remember what the colors mean, and the colors can vary from one company to another as well. So unless you're using needles all from one company like Janome, the colors might not mean that much to you. So keep your little box. This is a tip. Don't take all your needles out of the little box they come in. Keep all your needles in those little boxes so you know exactly what they are. I have a little plastic box that has dividers in it, and I keep all my needles in separate sections and all the same type together, so I know what I've got.
Schmidt's needles are the only ones, as far as I'm aware, that uses that specific color coding. Other needles may use a different kind of color coding.
Yeah, that's what I was just saying. You can't. It goes by brand. There's no standard in the industry for this. Okay, so the other type of needle too.
Also, so I was going to bring it down with me, but I forgot.
Yeah.
Most companies, Schmidt's produces a little manual that you can pick up at most sewing stores.
Oh, yeah.
That have, and it's free. It's just a little manual that tells you all the different needles and what they're for.
It's also available online as a PDF download. Just go to Schmidt's website and you'll find it.
Yeah, there. And they list all their needles and what each of their needles are for, and they describe what the color banding is for.
Yeah. Now, we mentioned organ needles, which are very popular in Europe, but organ needles have been around for many, many years, and they have one particular type of needle. They sell all kinds of needles.
Yeah, they Oregon has you can go on their website too, and they've got a giant list. They also are a large supplier of industrial needles for industrial manufacturing. So they have a domestic section and they have an industrial section on their site. Organ needles sometimes comes if in some sewing stores will come in the same kind of packages like these are in, but like the Schmidt's are in. But a lot of times the organ needles come in a very basic package like this. They're just a little.
They're just a little
paper
cardboard
filter, and then they have a little tinfoil wrap inside. So that's very basic,
which I don't like. The way they come, I like them in the plastic boxes better. But what you can do is if you have an empty plastic box, save it, put your organ needles in it if you like that method of storing them, and just write with a Sharpie on the outside what you've got in there. So you can get around it that way too. I just find when you're trying to get a needle out of one of those packages, you often get all the needles out of the package too. But organ needles are actually... Oregon makes a lot of the other companies' needles. They make Janome's needles. Yes. Okay, so Janome's name is on their needles. They are actually organ needles. But one needle that I really like, actually Walter got me hooked into it, is the titanium needles, which Oregon makes. And I have a little note about that here. It says titanium needles, which means they're coated with titanium. This titanium coating provides a smoother stitching experience by allowing the thread to glide smoothly through the eye of the needle as you stitch. Titanium also extends the life of a sewing machine needle from a measly 8 hours to a whopping 40 hours. So,
I don't know if you can actually see that.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
Okay, this is actually a titanium organ needle. And you can see it's a very gold color. Now, I believe Schmetz also makes a titanium needle, and they're also a gold color.
Yeah. So they do last longer. Now, it says here, though, from a measly 8 hours to a whopping 40 hours. Who sits down and every time clocks the time they're sitting at their sewing machine sewing? I know I certainly don't. So that's why I don't go by the number of hours. I go by the rule of, after every major project, changing your needle. With the titaniums, you could probably extend that to after 2 major projects. Maybe. It depends on what you're sewing, all that kind of thing.
I use my titanium needles mostly for embroidery.
Yeah, I use them for embroidery as well. Well, it's because he suggested it. But yeah, especially because you want something very sharp and something very strong, because think about it. Your embroidery machine is stitching upwards towards 1,000 stitches per minute. It's going very, very fast. And it's oftentimes going through multiple layers because it's just not the fabric it's going through fabric, stabilizer, and in some cases it's going through other threads that have already been laid down in a very tight formation. So you want a strong and sharp needle for that kind of thing. So anyways, that's organ needles. They've been around for 100 years or longer, and they're ones that your grandmother probably used. Maybe not the titanium, but they are a brand name company. They just don't look brand name. They look old-fashioned in that packaging.
Yeah, well, actually, they have updated their packaging and do produce they do produce something that looks similar to the Schmetz needles in some areas. You can get organ needles that look like that, but if you want if you want a real deal, you can get the ones that they package for industrial sewing or industrial type sewing, and they come in these little packages.
Well, you got those from what, Monfil?
Yes, I did.
Yeah. So, and you've heard us talk about Monfil before, MONFIL.
In fact,
.ca. We are not sponsored.
In fact, a lot of times when you purchase a sewing machine, like a Janome sewing machine, they will put in a package of these kind of needles in with their sewing machines
too. So, okay. So the next thing I have here on the list, it says a tip. Before inserting a new needle in your sewing machine, at the very least, take your fingernail and run it over the tip and point of the needle. If you feel it roughness, okay, whoever wrote this, bad English. If it feels rough or if it's bent, discard, which we've already said before. Okay, so choosing the right needle type. Okay, this article wants to break it down into 2 general types. General purpose needles is one, and that includes your universal, your ballpoint or jersey. Ballpoint needles are often called jersey needles as well, depending on the brand. And sharp or microtex. Those are the same kind of needle as well. And then the other category is specialty needles for, we have already mentioned jean needle for jean material, metallics, leather. Leather has a special needle too. And then there's the top stitch. Now we're going to talk about the top stitch because both Walter and I use top stitch needles quite a bit. And then there's a twin needle, which we have an amusing story about those when we come to it. So, so you've got to decide on 2 things when you're choosing your sewing needle. Your fiber in your fabric, or the weight of it, and of course your thread weight, or which really means its thickness. Now here's where things get confusing. The numbers. As you can see on these, the Schmetz are 9014s, and let me just switch that over so you can see what I'm talking about. Here we go. The Schmetz are 9014, and the Sharps are 2012. 2 numbers. Well,
8012.
Or 8012, sorry, 8012. The 2 numbers, one number, the first number, the higher number, the 90 and the 80, that's European sizes. The 14 and the 12 are North American sizes.
So technically they're both the same size needle. It's just they were sized by a different method.
Now, I'm not sure if those numbers are millimeters and inches.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know
think
what
they
mean.
are.
They generally mean thickness of the needle. So the higher the first number, or the higher the number, the thicker the needle. The lower the number, the thinner the needle.
Yeah. I don't know if thickness is the right way to put it. I think it has to do with eye size.
No, eye size changes depending on the type of needle you have.
Yeah.
Like a top stitch needle has a bigger eye than a jeans needle, but the 9014 is still the same size needle.
Yeah. Okay. It gets confusing, but basically, the higher the number, the
bigger.
The bigger the needle. Yeah.
So a higher number needle often is used for, well, they allow for a bigger hole too.
For a thicker thread.
But a thicker thread, and they're a stronger needle, so they'll go through thicker fabric. But it also depends on how big a hole you want in your fabric.
Yeah. And also, this is where it gets confusing, is when you're matching up thread for your needle size, because thread comes in like weights: 40 weight, 50 weight, 60 weight, 100 weight. The higher the number in thread, the thinner the thread.
No, that's only for Aurifil threads.
I thought that was for all threads.
No, that's not for all threads. That's only for certain kinds of threads. I talked to you the other day, Gutermann thread. I have an Aurifil 12 weight thread, and then I have a what they call a Tex Gutermann thread of 100, and it's about the same size as the Aurifil 12.
Well, okay, there goes the ease. I thought I had this down pat. We are going to talk about threads next week, so we'll leave that discussion about thread weights then. But basically, yeah, okay, I won't go any further because I'll confuse you. So just know that the higher the number on a needle, the thicker the needle.
So a lot of times with threads, let's say, if you look at the manufacturer of the thread, they will recommend a needle size for that thread. If you can find, let's say, if you look online at the manufacturer, they will often suggest a needle size. But if you're using a regular sewing style thread for sewing regular fabrics, usually an 80-12 or a 90-14 will do.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk then about some of the more common specialty needles, like the jersey or the ballpoint. They're both the same needle. One is called jersey, another manufacturer may call it ballpoint. But according to my notes, it says that ballpoint needles are ideal for knits that don't contain high amounts of lycra, such as jersey and ITY knits, which I don't know what ITY knits are. Because of their more rounded tips, ballpoint needles slide between the yarns of knits so that they don't snag or make holes. This needle can be had in sizes 70/10 to 100/16. So 70 to 100 or 10 to 16, depending on whether you're going European or North American. So
I have some jersey needles here.
And wait just a second.
That I've used. Okay. I have some jersey needles here that I've used. And I use it for actually sewing jersey, or some knit fabric, or fleece fabric, and they are supposed to have a ballpoint tip. But I mean, if you actually take them out of the package, the needle still feels pretty sharp.
Yeah, so don't be sticking your finger under it.
It's not like it will bounce off your finger. It'll go right through it. Ow. But it does supposedly have a ballpoint. And it's supposed to push the fabric pieces apart rather than piercing them and cutting them. So that's what I use for stretchy material. There's also another material. There's one called stretch. A type of, I don't have any of those, but that's often, I think, used for a lycra and like bathing suit material and stuff like that. I could be wrong about that, but as far as I know, that's what they're used for.
Yeah. Now, if you use a sharp needle, which we're going to talk about in a second, on something that you should be using a ballpoint or jersey needle on, what happens is you will cut your fibers in your fabric, and as such, because jersey tends to be stretchier than that, it'll then start to unravel. So that's why you need the ballpoint, because they don't actually cut the fabric, they sort of push between the fibers to do the stitch through it. Now if you use a ballpoint on something like when you're when you're doing piecework for a quilt, then you'll have a problem. You'll probably hear thunk, 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 because your needle isn't sharp enough to pierce the way it's supposed to the quilting cotton.
Yeah, that's the same as if you use try and sew a jeans type material or a cotton twill. You may find that it'll sew through one or two thicknesses of fabric, not too bad, but as soon as you start getting into the thicker seams, it won't go through it because it won't pierce.
Yeah. So speaking of sharps, just going to go to the next slide here. So here are, now sometimes you'll hear them referred to as sharps, sometimes you'll hear them referred to as microtex. But they're what we was just saying. These are the ones that you want to use with regular fabric, not on jersey or something like that. Or
generally cotton fabrics and things like that. Nothing that, fabrics that generally don't stretch.
Well, you could probably use them on polyester too.
You can use them on stretch, what do you call it? Stretch cotton twill or something like that, because it's a blend of cotton and stretchy materials.
Now, according to my notes, it says these needles are a slim needle with a very sharp point and are designed for sewing densely woven fabrics such as polyester, faux suede and leather, microfibers, vinyl or laminate, silks, and high thread count fabrics like batiks. Now, they mentioned leather on there. You can actually get a needle that's specially designed. It's called a leather needle.
And those have actually like a cut tip to them, so that will cut right through the leather.
Yeah, through the leather, because it's a specialty. But I've never used a leather needle because I've never really sewn in leather. So I can't say any more about that.
Yeah, neither have I.
Yeah, but just be aware that they are available. Now it says because microtex needles pierce fabric cleanly, they produce a very straight stitch. This also makes them ideal for top stitching and edge stitching, buttonholes, and heirloom sewing. We'll come back to the top stitch needles in a moment. The needle comes in the following sizes. It comes in 60/8, 70/10, 80/12, and 90/14. So basically covers all the sizes pretty much that you'd ever really need to use. Then of course there's the needle Walter just talked about, stretch needles. So that takes us to top stitch needles. And well, what's top stitching? Well, top stitching is basically when you're finishing off a garment. Walter just did a lot of top stitching on a jacket.
I guess an easy example would be everybody wears blue jeans, right? And blue jeans have that yellow, iconic yellow stitching down the side of the seams. That's considered a top stitch.
Yeah. And if you're making bags, for example, you may use this top stitch as you're finishing the bag to go along the top of the bag where the lining is held inside, just to give it off a nice finishing edge, professional look. Top stitching you might use when you're binding a quilt. I don't tend to, but you could.
And yeah, so sometimes with the top stitching, sometimes you use a thicker thread. And so then you would have to change your needle accordingly, size-wise.
Because, and it says in the notes here, top stitch needles have an extra large eye and a deeper groove to accommodate thicker top stitching thread, or the use of 2 strands of all-purpose threads simultaneously. So yeah, so they have a larger eye, because oftentimes decorative threads that you might be using in a top stitch, like in the jeans, is going to be a little thicker. So you need a little bigger eye on them. So that's...
Now, I recently made a coat that has top stitching on it, and I'm using an Orifil 12 thread, Orifil's 12 thread, and its recommended size of needle is either a 90/14 or a 116 top stitch needle. I was using the 90/14 because it worked better. for some reason my machine didn't like the larger needles, so I ended up going back down to the smaller needles. So.
And that brings up a very interesting point too about this. We're telling you all the things the manufacturers tell you you should use your needles for, but you want to know something? You may have to break out of that box sometimes. It's going to depend on the combination of thread and your fabric. So if you find that your needle is breaking often, then go to another size up. If you find that your stitches are a little bit loose or irregular, go to a size down from
just don't always accept what a manufacturer has suggested for needle size for a particular type of thread. For instance, I was using an Orifel 12 weight thread, which is a very thick thread that Orifel makes, and it's a cotton thread. And it recommended using a 116 top stitch needle, which is this package. And for some reason, my stitches were all I was missing stitches, and I was having trouble with the stitches. So then I went back, and I had accidentally started stitching with a 9014 needle, and it was working okay. So I went back to the 9014 needle, and it worked fine after that. So you can't just sit there and go, oh, it tells me to use this needle, and it's not working properly. Sometimes you have to experiment with different needles.
Take control of your machine and of your sewing experience. Do what works for you. Okay.
However, you should still use something like a jersey needle for jersey fabric, and a jeans needle for jeans or cotton fabric, or you can use you said quilting needles or whatever?
Quilting needles.
Yeah.
And
some people use top stitch needles just for sewing. So
yeah, and the ones that say quilting needles on them, I really don't know what the difference is. I should look that one up, because actually I don't bother anymore since I use titanium all the time. But again, it's whatever you get comfortable with and whatever works for you. Okay, so that takes us to another type of needle that is one that a lot of people don't know what to do with, and that's the twin needle. Now, right off the bat, you can see there are two needles stuck together on this little bar. All right, do not take the needles off the bar. It kind of kills the purpose. So I have never really used a twin needle except to play around with it. So Walter has. So tell them
I have
what you do with
used the twin needle instead of using a cover stitch machine. You can use it. A lot of people use it to hem their garment projects or whatever. They want the two-line stitching, and the what ends up happening is you have to use two top threads in your sewing machine, and just thread each of these two needles at the bottom and use a common bobbin underneath. And what you'll end up getting is something that looks somewhat like an overlock, and you'll get it'll be a little bit better for stretchy material to use the two needles, because you'll be able to stretch the stitch a bit that you get for the hem, especially if you're doing a jersey project or something like that. So a lot of people use that to get a two-stitched hem. You may also want to use it to get a decorative stitch that will give you two lines of stitching that are evenly spaced apart.
Which is kind of cool, because that can be a really neat effect. But when you thread these needles, Walter's already sort of mentioned it here, you are pulling your thread, both strands of thread, through the same holes and gauges on your sewing machine. When you get down to threading the needle, you cannot use your automatic threader. You will have to thread these by hand.
Not only that, you have to have the ability to have two spools of thread on your sewing machine.
Yeah, so you'll need a thread stand, or if you have an extra auxiliary, is that the word? Yeah, auxiliary. No, delivery at the door. Yeah, now I'm thrown off here. If you have What was I talking about?
You're
I've lost my train of thought. The phone went off. I'm like a squirrel.
you're talking about the double needle and threading both of them, and you need 2 spools of thread.
Yes, you need 2 spools of thread. So your sewing machine will probably come with 1 thread spool on it. If you don't, but you may have an an extra one that also attaches in the top of your machine, or get a thread stand that can handle two things of thread.
And of course, if you want both colors of your top stitching thread to be the same color, you need 2 spools of the same thread. Yeah. Or you can do a decorative stitch and have one color of one thread
and I've done that.
Different color of another thread. It's up to you.
And I have done that, and it is kind of cool. They're kind of fun to play with that. But just don't take them off that little blue bar or whatever color it will be.
Well, yeah, one of the ladies was in my sewing class was it was suggested to her to use a twin needle for doing a hem on a shirt, and she looked at the needle and she said, "Well, my needle has this funny bar on the top of it. Should I take that off?" Well, that kind of defeats the purpose. It's there to hold the 2 needles, and the top post goes into your hole of your sewing machine, so it'll be able to hold the 2 needles. So
now, oftentimes when you buy a new sewing machine, you'll get a variety pack of needles, and it may include a twin needle, but they're easy to get. Now, one thing else about this, if you notice on the packages that I'm showing up here on screen, they show a whole bunch of numbers on there. What does that mean? Well, it says on the packet, the first number tells the distance between the 2 needles, and the second number is the needle size. So it says, although this example up here...
Yeah, mine says that too. It says 4, 0/100.
Yeah, so I'm not really sure which one. Well, 130/705... that's probably the distance between the 2 needles. One in European.
130. We should have addressed that because I'm not 100% sure. I thought it was the style of the needle that all of them have that, right?
Oh, do they?
130/75. I think that's for a domestic sewing machine.
Oh, okay.
But I'm not 100% sure. We should actually have researched that before.
Okay. We'll get back to you on that one because I'm not really sure. Don't use a lot of those needles. Okay, so then, of course, we come around to the universal needle, and a lot of people try to...
Yes, but that's on every needle. Jersey needles, jeans needles, everything.
What?
137.05.
Oh, okay. I was ahead of this now. I wasn't going back to that, but anyway. Let's confuse everybody even more than we're doing now. Okay, we'll research that. Okay, if you see the picture on your screen right now, I'm showing 2 packages of universal needles. And yes, as Walter says, the 130/705 shows up on most of the packages. So it's the set of numbers below on these 2 particular packages, 70/10 and 80/12. So the 10 are a little thinner than the 12s. All right, universal. Meaning you can use those on anything. Well, is that true? Because this is what a universal needle is by definition. They have a slightly rounded point that makes it versatile enough for sewing synthetics, natural woven fabrics, and some knits such as ponte knits.
Yes, ponte is a type of knit.
So basically, I don't know. I have a set of universal needles. I've never used them. I suppose in a pinch, if I had run out of all my other needles, which is impossible because of the number I have, then I guess I could go to a universal. But I don't think it's a good idea. Some people just say, oh yeah, give me a universal needle because I have no idea what I'm doing. Well, I suppose that might solve the problem to a certain degree. But I don't even know why they make universal needles.
Okay, 130/705 is for standard home sewing machines.
Oh, that's what it means?
That's the number, yeah.
Oh, okay, so if you see 130/705 is for a domestic machine. So I'm assuming there's a different number for needles for a long arm, I'm sure, and whatever. I don't know. Okay, so we've learned something new every day. So basically, yeah, universal needles, and they come in a range of sizes, it says here, from 60/8 up to 120/19. So basically you can get a universal needle It's more universal in terms of what you're going to be sewing in, not universal to thread size. You still need to know what size of needle you need for the weight of thread that you're using. So, yeah, are you confused now about it? My suggestion is don't buy universal needles. Okay, next part of this says choosing the right needle size. Generally, it's a good idea to use the smallest needle size you can for the fabric you're sewing with. They said for Schmidt's needles, both the American and European needle size is listed on the packet. European sizes range from 60 to 120, while American sizes range from 8 to 19. So 19 would be the thickest, 8 would be the thinnest, the finest. The European number indicates the actual diameter of the shaft in hundredths of a millimeter. Okay, so we've got that number figured out. While the American numbers are arbitrarily assigned. For example, if the size on a needle pack is 80/12, then 80 is the European measurement and 12 is the American assigned number. But there's a problem. The European number actually is done in hundredths of a millimeter, so it's a physical size. The numbers that are on the American designation of it, North American designation, are just arbitrarily assigned. It doesn't mean anything except that the larger the number, the thicker the needle.
However, the ones that I've seen the most, and the ones that I've used the most are either the 80/12s or the 90/14s, right?
Yeah, well, I usually use 90/14.
90/14. Right. But I either use 80/12 or 90/14 as my standard. I've never ever gone below that and used a smaller needle. And I rarely have used a larger needle than a 90/14.
Yeah. So, now it also says here, so the lower the number, the finer the needle. We've already figured that out. And the smaller the hole it makes when it pieces your fabric. Conversely, the thicker the needle, the stronger it is to penetrate thick fabrics without bending or breaking, and the larger the hole it makes when it pieces your fabric. So we've already kind of talked about that already. So they give an example, like lightweight fabrics such as chiffon, silk, or organza, you would use, like in American numbers, a 9 or an 11. Medium weight, like cotton, flannel, linen, synthetics, use a 12 or a 14. Well, that's, as a quilter, those are the ones I use the most. I use 14 most of the time.
I've never sewn silk, so
no, and I've never sewn silk either. So, what that? Then heavyweight such as denim, twill, cotton canvas, use a 14 or 16. Is what they're saying. Again, you have to take a little swatch of your fabric and a needle and try it out before you get into, actually working on your garment or on your quilt to make sure that everything is working for you, because these are guidelines.
Yeah, and actually for the really heavy fabric that I've been sewing, I actually use an 80/12 needle.
Well, that's actually what they said here too. Said for general sewing of medium weight fabrics, you usually can't go wrong with a size 80/12 universal needle.
Okay.
So,
but actually I use a jeans needle, but
okay. That takes, so basically that's it. There's other specialty needles you can get to. There are some needles that are called embroidery needles. They're meant for embroidery, machine embroidery.
Yeah, I have one of those.
You have one of those?
Yeah.
And, wait just a second, I gotta switch over so people can see better. Okay.
I have some of these. I actually use the Oregon titanium usually, but I was using these as well. And they're very good for embroidery. So that's a good example as well.
And what else do you have over there? Anything that we haven't talked about?
Well, we have the Janome needles.
Well, we're coming to the Janome. They're a separate category altogether on themselves. There is another type of...
Oh, yeah. There's another needle that we have not talked about. And...
well, let me guess. This is what I'm about to say. Let me see. Come on. Hurry. Say what it is.
That you need special needles for an overlock machine.
Oh, no. That was
or like a serger overlock or a cover stitch machine. And they're...
no, just... Well, that it's there. You're okay.
They're specialty needles. Well, this one is one specific that was sold for overlock, and it has several different sizes in it. But you need these for an overlock machine, and the reason why is that most overlock machine needles are a little shorter than regular sewing machine needles.
I did not know that.
Yes. So, and you can cause problems with your overlock or serger machine if you try and put a regular needle in it.
Well, I've never done that, but
yeah, you need special needles for that.
Okay, that is good to know. The other type I thought you might be going to mention are needles meant to work with metallic threads. Metallic threads have a different thickness to them, and they tend to be a little more breakable. They readily break more, so it's best to get ones that are listed as metallic needle threads, because the eye in those is designed to accommodate the size of a metallic thread. And that's as scientific as I'm going to get with that, because I don't sew with metallic threads. I've never had a lot of luck with it. But then again, that may have been because I tried that in the first of my sewing career and didn't know what I was doing. And some would probably say you don't know what you're doing now. So what else you got there? Anything that?
Nope, that's it.
That's it? Okay. So, how to store used needles, okay? Because if you're replacing your needle, as you should be on a regular basis, and you have ones that have broken or they've bent or whatever, you shouldn't just toss them in the garbage for safety reasons. One, if you got pets or small kids laying around and it drops out of the garbage can, or even in your sewing room it falls out of your garbage can or something, and you step on it, that's not fun. You don't want an animal eating it. You don't want to suck them up in your vacuum cleaner. Okay, that's not good. So how do you get rid of them? Well, they recommend, now if for some legitimate reason you need to store a needle that you've already, this is about storing a needle you've already used, leave a short length of thread in it before returning it to the original storage case. This way you'll know which needles have been previously used. You know, I have a tendency to just put them back in the little box, but I didn't think of that, putting a little piece of thread on it, because you can't tell whether it's been used or not when you put it back in the box.
Actually, what I usually do when it's kind of stupid, but the needles are usually one orientation or another orientation in the box, and I usually flip it.
Okay, well that's
so I know that it's been used.
See, I would never remember to do that. The other thing too is, and I've done this, so you're replacing your needle. Actually, you're swapping out a needle. You're moving, say, to a top stitch needle from the needle you might have been using for piecing and the whole bit. Well, I just have a tendency to pull it out of the machine and stick it into a pin cushion kind of a thing beside me. Then it's maybe a few days before I come back to it, or maybe a few months, and I look and go, I have no idea what that needle was, how long I've used it, or whatnot. At that point, I just get rid of it. So a little piece of thread in it, that's not a bad idea. Just have to try that.
I sometimes sew jersey and jeans interchangeably, so I have to take the needle out and switch the two. But I may have only used the jersey needle for a very small piece of project, and I don't think it's ready to be thrown out, so that's why I will put it back in its box. But I'll either put it in upside down, or I'll put the
you cheap bastard,
the rounded one, if all my needles have the rounded side pointing up, I'll put the flat side up, or the other way around. So I know that the needle that I've got, the one needle that's in a different orientation, is the needle that I've used before.
I'm just questioning your whole methodology. It sounds very logical and like you should do that, but then you can't find your scissors most days, which I don't know how you manage to remember to stick your needles upside down. Well, whatever. So that brings up the situation with disposing of needles. Well, what I do and what a lot of people do is you save an old prescription bottle and you throw your needles into that. And then when the prescription bottle gets filled, you dispose of it in whatever method is acceptable to your municipality.
That or just any bottle that'll hold it.
Yeah, any bottle. Or something else I've heard of is you can go to your drugstore and apparently you can get from the pharmacist one of their needle disposing boxes, the ones they use after they've given you a shot, and they get rid of the needle in that. And then you can take that, when you get it filled up or whatever, you can take it back to the pharmacy and they'll see that it gets disposed of properly. I have never done that, and I just heard about that on something not too long ago. So probably worth looking into. But whatever it is, you don't want to just throw them naked in the garbage. Some people will take them, wrap them up in many layers of a piece of copy paper or something, tape it around, and then throw them out that way. Because, people could stick their hands into your garbage, like garbage men, or they're picking up the bag and they're poking out, and, well, that's not nice. They get stabbed on your needles, and heaven only knows.
I do that for razor blades too. I'll wrap my razor blades in masking tape.
Okay, so yeah, and you can find all kinds of different things on YouTube about disposing of sewing needles. So we've talked about all the various kinds, or the most commonly used kinds. And we've talked about what the numbers mean on them. We've talked about the relationship between needles and thread sizes and needles and fabric and things like that. But we have Janome machines, as you well know. So Janome, of course, being Janome, they have their own set of needles. Now, we've already told you that their needles, from what we know, are actually manufactured by Oregon, and Janome puts their name on them. But Janome has 3 principal types of needle, and they go by color. And I'm just going to switch here so you can see what I mean. So this picture is of the ones called the purple tip Janome needles, and they are a purple tip. And here, Walter's got an actual ones here he can show you. So that's what they look like.
Actually, they were sold in a box that has no markings on it. So
yeah, those are purple tips, although they look like blue in this video. So let me go back to my picture here. So the purple tip needles these are a 14 ballpoint needle specially designed for Janome machines. The needle is best for heavyweight knits and dense embroidery designs. It is the recommended needle for quilting with cotton fabrics. I have used a purple tip needle when I've been piecing before. But as I said, now I've gone pretty much to the titanium. But it is a ballpoint needle. So here's where the confusion runs. This is an article I downloaded from Janome.com some time ago. But I have looked at other Janome documentation about their needles, and they don't necessarily tell you exactly the same thing. So you can go to a Janome red tip needle. And actually, this is what I would use for piecing if I'm not using my actual titaniums. And you have some here. So just show those. They're actually what they look like in the box. And those are the red tip ones. They're a 14. They're a sharp point, which the point is good for general sewing of medium weight fabrics. And those would be the ones that I would recommend for quilting when you're piecing. The other, oops, sorry, I had the picture up here and I have to switch it over. I'm getting my camera. Here's what the red tips look like. There we go. Sorry about that. I'm running 2 things here at the same time.
I don't have any blue tips.
And Walter doesn't have any blue tips. Well, the blue tips are these.
Yeah.
And they're an 11 needle, and it says this is size 11 ballpoint needle, specially designed for Janome machines. The needle works well on light, medium weight knit fabrics, and is a recommended needle for light to medium weight embroidery. Also, it works well when quilting with polyester thread. So here's where the confusion comes. This is a ballpoint needle, but they're saying essentially the same thing as they said for the purple tip needle.
I thought I heard that the blue tip has a bigger hole in it. Has it got a bigger hole?
It might have a bigger hole because it's an 11.
Yeah, okay.
The other ones are a 14. So 14 means a thinner
it's a bigger
shaft.
Needle.
That's right. It's a bigger needle. Oh my God. This really gets to you. Okay. So, yeah. This is the confusion. You can see that I'm confused.
One problem with the Janome needles is it's not very well documented.
No, they're not. And I've even had dealers contradict themselves. I've been told I should be using this type of needle, for example, on my embroidery machine from Janome, and then another time I was told I should use the other one.
Yeah, I've been told by the same dealer that I should be using a purple tip needle for embroidery, and then other people have said they've been told, like him, have been told to use blue tip. So
Yeah. So, the rule of thumb then is this, what I said earlier. Experiment first before you get started on a major project. Find out what's working for the fabric you have chosen for that project and the needle that works with that, and that's what you use.
Yeah, what I often do before I start a new project, I take a scrap of fabric from my project, like a garment project, and first I test out thread color. I'm testing thread color and needle size at the same time. If it's something that's standard like quilting cotton or jeans type material or twill, I generally already know what works in my machine for needles. But you don't know that for sure with any fabric. So I take a scrap of cloth and I do some sample stitching. It also gives me the opportunity to select what color thread I'm using as well. And that way you get a chance to see how it stitches. In a recent project that I was doing with a coat, one of the ladies in my class was complaining that she had a heavier thread and she had a top stitch needle, but that thread and top stitch needle weren't working properly with her machine. And I had suggested for her to use a different top stitch needle, but she kept saying that, well, that was the needle that was recommended by the manufacturer of that thread to use that needle, and that was the correct needle. So, and she wouldn't experiment with a different type of needle. But so her top stitching never worked out well. But and I had similar problem in that the recommended size of the needle with the thread that I was using wasn't working. So I switched needles to another needle that I was using before, and it worked fine. So yeah, some of it is experimentation. Yeah, there's these needles, jeans needles, jersey needles are good for specific fabrics and stuff like that, and you just sort of use it as a guide, but then you can end up switching it around to something else. Like you have something called jeans needles, and you can use it for cotton twill and and other things. But a lot of people use jeans needles to piece quilts because they like using the needle, and it's a sharp needle. So some people use top stitching needles to piece quilts. It depends on whatever you get used to.
That's true. So basically what I have up on the screen right now is a little chart, and this is in the show notes. This whole article that came from Janome.com, I've done a link for it. It's a PDF in the show notes, and in the last page it has this chart which shows you the two numbers, European and America, for the needle sizes, and it tells you a recommended type of fabric. So like the 8, which is a very thin needle for sheer fabrics, for example. So your organzas, your chiffon probably, things like that. And then up from there, and you can see how it gives you a good estimate of what size you should be using. But as we've already said, you need to experiment before you get started on your project to make sure everything is working for you. So troubleshooting is something they talk about in this article, and it's basically, this is a good review of some of the things we've already said. If the thread is breaking or shredding, go up one needle size or try a top stitch needle. If the stitches are skipping, change the type of needle point, a ball point or a sharp. If the thread is bouncing, go down one size. It means it's too loose in the eye. Check the needle plate, bobbin, case, and hook often. Any small imperfections may snag the thread as it passes and cause breakage. And of course, which we harp on all the time, clean the machine often. And that means when you're cleaning your machine, you're cleaning out the little dust bunnies from underneath the foot plate. Get that brush up in there around where the mechanism is that holds the needle as well, because fuzz can build up under there and cause a problem.
Also, when he's saying about cleaning in where the bobbin sits, also the bobbin sits in a bobbin case, so you should pull the bobbin case out and clean underneath as well.
Yeah, and I don't remember if I threw this chart up when I was talking about it. Was it up there, or was I talking to us? Just in case I didn't, there it is. That's the chart I'm talking about. It's in the show notes. It's difficult running two cameras at times. Okay, So that's what we have about needles. I hope this cleared up some mystery. I hope we didn't confuse you further, because it is so easy to be confused about it. I guess
people that end up sewing for long periods of time get used to the needles that they're using and everything. It's really people that are just starting out, beginning sewing, have some difficulty trying to figure out and select what needles they're going to use.
What I was going to say is, don't be afraid to experiment. Just don't experiment on the actual thing you're trying to create first. I mean, and think outside of the box. If it's not working for you, then try a different needle, try a different thread until it does work for you. Don't be afraid to do that. And then, as Walter has said, as you have more experience, you'll probably find you're going to the same combination for most things time and time again. Okay, so what, you got something there you want to show?
No.
Oh, okay, you're just playing with yourself. I mean, playing with your needles. Okay, whatever. So that is our rendition of needle sizes. That takes us then to thread, which is next week's topic, and we'll probably confuse you even more with that than we have with this. So stay tuned for
Thread
confusion.
Can be pretty confusing.
Yeah. So you thought needles were confusing. Thread, even more so. So that's what we'll be talking about next week. So thank you so much for joining us today, and have a good weekend, or whatever time of the week it is when you see this. And we'll see you next week. Bye for now. Say goodbye,
Bye.
Walter.
Bye.